So, hello and welcome back to Unparliamentary Language for another one of our silly season specials, our last one before we get back into proper politics. And today we're going to be discussing voting and electoral systems. How are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, yes. In the middle of being too much of a social butterfly, so apologies to people who are listening right now for the late start. But no, pretty good. Kind of glad I haven't had to pay too much attention to politics for the last 3 episodes, but aware that I need to start reading up again for the next normal episode.
Oh, it doesn't stop. I know that we've done these episodes because politics takes a holiday, but it's been rumbling on in the background.
Yes, there is lots to talk about in our next episode, but let's leave it at that for now. So, did you want to have a kind of a brief introduction overview, or do you want to just plough straight on into our main topic title?
I mean, you said it's not proper politics, but I take umbrage at that fact because this is what I got into. So I got into politics for. It's kind of, I really like talking about voting systems because it's not as overtly political as some of the other subjects we do. It doesn't really matter if you're left or right wing or anything like that. It's more about how all the numbers boil down and how it affects people's behavior when it comes to voting. So I'm really interested to start on this topic at the moment. The way I was going to structure it, if it's okay with you, is that we sort of go historically, and that also shows you the way that voting systems have got slowly more complicated over time, or as people have tried to make them fairer, new methods have come in. So if you're good to start, shall we just jump in with first past the post?
Yeah, that sounds great. So we're just going to work through the various systems at this stage. Okay, yep. So first past the post. What's that, Rob, other than the system we're currently using in the UK?
So it's the most basic system that there is. Essentially, it means that you hold an election where one person can win. So by that, I mean that this system is used where you've got either one president can be elected or one person within a constituency or a representative area can win. And the person with the most votes gets elected. There's no need for it to be over half the votes. If you've got 5 candidates, one gets 21%, all the others get 19 point whatever percent, the one with 21% wins, and everybody has to accept that result.
Okay, and I think we've touched on some of the problems with this in the past already on our episodes. As you say, in that example you just gave, that means 20% of people would be very happy with the result, and then there's 38% of people, which is more people, being sad with the result. So that's where we tend to have this lead into discussing other systems, because this is the system most people understand, that it's easy to explain, but it's easy to explain, as you said, but it seems fair on the kind of when you first look at it. But actually, when you come up with these situations like that one, you can see how it can feel unfair to a larger range of the voting public, and then that leads to problems. Because if the majority of people don't feel they're being represented by policy and stuff, then you get people being annoyed at the kind of system problem we have at the moment, where nearly everyone seems to be pissed off at the government for various reasons, because they don't necessarily represent their views. You can't please everyone when voting, but you'd want to try and please the majority of people, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, precisely. And having it as that simple system, I kind of said we do it historically. If I read off a list of the countries that still enforce this system, so you've got Bangladesh, Canada, Chile, India, Nepal, and sorry, I'm using a very good book on the subject, United Kingdom and the United States. The kind of thing that links all of those countries, I think, is Britain and old empire.
Yeah.
Almost. It's the countries that keep it hardly ever do it because it's the best system, almost because it's the one that they started with, and they haven't decided to change it. In its defense, it is remarkably simple, as we've already said. As we get into the other ones as we go along, you might be asking the question, well, how more complicated can the other systems be? You're about to find out, essentially.
Yeah.
They can get a little tricky.
So that system is called plurality, or referred to as plurality.
The first way people thought of improving that is the main problem with it as we've said, is that you can end up with a majority of people who are displeased with the result. Okay, so as we've kind of described, if there are three parties in there, one gets 41%, the other gets 39%, and a third party gets 20%, then you're left with people annoyed at the result. So the one thing that people came to, the next idea people had to make sure that this didn't happen was making sure that you got a majority. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. The clearest example might be the French presidential elections. Are you aware of this?
Yeah, I think we discussed it in passing. Did we not? We discussed Macron and all of that earlier on in the year, didn't we?
Yeah, possibly,
and they have runoff elections. So you have a vote, and then they knock out, I believe they knock out the person with the least votes, and then they have another vote until it's obvious that there is a majority. But it's not like they always have a set number of votes. They just keep going until at least one person has a majority of the votes. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. I think in France they have the first round, only the top two go through to the final.
Right, okay.
Essentially. So that's led to situations in the past where there are lots of parties on the left in France, and there are only about two on the right. So there was one where not new Le Pen, but her father, old Le Pen, who I can't remember his first name, ended up in a runoff against Jacques Chirac, who was the other conservative. Essentially, to try and make like a UK comparison, the French were left with a choice between Margaret Thatcher and Nick Griffin of the BNP.
Yeah.
So where actually, if you'd grouped all the votes together that were from left-leaning parties, they would have far out, they would have at least defeated the Nick Griffin character, Le Pen, on the right. So it's not always perfect. So that's one problem with that French system. The other problem with having more than one election is that it's quite costly for people to put on, and it demands quite a lot of engagement from citizens. And particularly in the case of that French election, turnout can go massively down for the second election, particularly if you just don't support either candidate or don't have a preference. So it makes it a little less legitimate, the final result, if maybe the turnout was only 40% for that second runoff, when in the first election it was closer to 80% or something like that. So the way they get around that, and that you have one election to sort everything out, is through the alternative vote system.
So I think it's probably worth mentioning. So if first past the post is the one people will be most used to from voting in an actual election in the UK, alternative vote is, or at least STV, which I think we're going to get onto in our description of alternative vote. So you may have heard about it when we had a referendum on whether we should change how we vote in the UK. But also, you will probably have come across it as it's how most university elections are run for their students' unions. At least that is the case of all the university student unions I've been involved in. It may not be the case of everything, but I think it's probably the one recommended by the NUS. So that's where you will have heard of it before, or at least that might help you latch on to how it works.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to describe how it works then?
Yeah. So with, I suppose, so single transferable vote is the version I'm used to. So let me describe that, which is, when you said alternative vote here, is that synonymous with STV, or is alternative vote just anything that isn't first past the post?
My understanding of STV is used where you have multiple. If you have like a council and there are 5 seats available, you use single transferable vote to elect all of those 5 members out of one pool of votes.
Right. Okay, I see. Yeah.
Alternative vote is where you just have one position available.
Right. Okay.
And the votes are redistributed. Right.
Okay. So in that, I just wanted to clarify that. So alternative vote then is you go in and you have a ballot paper with all of the possible candidates for the one position, and you vote in preference order. So say it was the UK general election and you had your options of Theresa May. I mean, I know this is not how it works, but let's just say you were voting for the heads of the parties. You would be voting for Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn, and Vince Cable, and of course the other parties, but those are the 3 main ones. And you would go in and you would say, oh, well, I think, for you might say, oh, well, I think Vince Cable is the person for me, put a 1 next to his name. And then you go, well, I'm a bit more fiscally conservative, so I go for Theresa May in second. And then you go, oh, maybe I'm okay, you either do or don't then put your third one next to Corbyn, depending on how you feel. You may actually just have a preference of all three, or you may stop at some point. So then you tally up those votes, and as we know, the Liberal Democrats don't get a massive share of the vote, so you'd count them all up, and overall say it's quite close between Labour and Conservatives, as it was in the last election. Well, then your vote in place number one for Vince Cable doesn't mean anything anymore because he hasn't won. So you then go down to your second choice. So they then add up all of everyone's second choices and see if there's then a clear majority. So in that situation, maybe, you choosing to put Theresa May down second is what helps tip it in Theresa May's favour, and she then wins the general election based on it. Is that a good enough summary, do you think?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is, and I'm going to add maths into this.
Yep.
So imagine that there are 100 votes cast, and there are 41 for Theresa May, 39 for Jeremy Corbyn, and 20 for Vince Cable, or at least those are the first preferences that everybody's put down. In first past the post, Theresa May would win. But in alternative vote, she has to get at least 50 to go over that threshold and be declared the winner. So as soon as nobody has over... If Theresa May got 51 in the first round of voting, that would be it. Nothing else would happen with those votes. But because she hasn't got 50, that's when the votes of the lowest party, so in this case, like Vince Cable, their first choice would be discounted, and then they'd look to see who have they put number 2 on the list. And it might be the fact that, actually 15 people have put Jeremy Corbyn as their number 2, and only 5 have made it Theresa May. They redistribute that vote, and Jeremy Corbyn wins that election. So alternative vote is designed to make sure that no third party spoils the vote in a way, that people get their least worst candidate. It's kind of based on compromise, or at least they can vote for the candidate they really want to, even if they know that candidate hasn't got a realistic chance of winning the election, and still get their second choice in.
And also, I think that speaks to some of the stuff we mentioned before about the problems, like you said, with France having a lot of left parties and 2 right parties. And we've said a similar thing in the UK where, some of the voter, if you were trying to narrow it down to 2 parties, it's Labour versus Conservative. But then there's maybe 10% of people voting for the Lib Dems. Well, I imagine that if you took all of those Lib Dem votes and had a second choice, that a lot more of those would go to Labour than the Conservative side. At least that's my feeling. That's how it works. I may not be right, but I think generally the Liberal Democrats are more socially liberal and a bit more fiscally conservative. So you would assume that the social aspect would win out there, unless maybe they're a business owner, or for example. And so we've talked about splitting the vote, the Lib Dems having come out of Labour in the UK, and that would fix that problem, and it would feel more like a fair fight between left and right, perhaps.
So I think the most important thing to remember about, one of the most important things to remember about the alternative vote system is that it still has, it makes it slightly fairer, but it's still got some of the disadvantages of first past the post.
Yes.
In the example I've given you, if you're a third party, you're still likely not to win that seat. Yeah. It's still it still disadvantages the third party and is likely to lead to a 2-party system. But it stops that kind of spoilt election feeling where you have 59% against the 41% that actually ended up winning the election. The other thing with alternative vote is that because you're still voting sort of one member in at a time, or you're still in like little constituencies of votes, it could ultimately mean that the amount of votes cast might not match the number of seats won in the end, which is something we've seen in US presidential elections, for example. Donald Trump got 2 million votes less than Hillary Clinton. That's because they had a first past the post system. The same could still happen in alternative vote to an extent. At least they've got the 50% redrawn. So, I think that brings us to the end of our sort of simple sort of majoritarian systems.
Yeah, just a note there. You've put AV plus under AV. What is the difference between AV plus and AV? Have we just described one or the other, or is it a very minor distinction?
There's a very minor distinction between the two. I think that the example I wanted to give was that, so in AV systems, you can have as many parties running as you want. So you could have 7 parties, and those all get drawn up, and you could have 7 preferences. It's very unlikely that it would go on that long, but you could have 7 rounds of voting before anybody gets over 50%. In the London mayoral election, which I think is AV+, but I might be wrong here, but it's certainly one that's a very odd example. You could have as many parties running as possible, but you were only allowed a first and second preference.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
So the winner might not necessarily get 50% after one round. It was because the electoral rules were drawn up by Tony Blair's Labour Party, and at the time Ken Livingstone was thrown out of Labour and ran as an independent candidate. And Labour were really worried that Ken Livingstone would split the vote and a Conservative mayor would be elected if they ran it by a conventional first past the post. So they put an AV system in, but they put the only AV system in that would meant that, people might vote Ken Livingstone first, but then their second choice would definitely be Labour, but we probably don't want to redistribute their votes anywhere else after that, so the Lib Dems or Greens get in. As it turned out, Ken Livingstone won it anyway on the first choice and got everybody's first choice. So, and then subsequently rejoined the Labour Party. But that's just a little odd footnote, and I guess it's a good example of how, with these electoral systems, the people setting them up usually have an idea of the kind of system they want to create or the type of result that they want to create from
a vested interest.
Yes, which is why electoral systems get changed so little, or very few countries sort of come together and say, we're going to update our electoral system because it benefits the winners. If you keep winning by that system, why would you want to risk losing some power?
Yeah, so I looked it up. I posted it in the chat while we were discussing there. The London mayoral election uses supplementary vote is the term they use for it, which, as you say, is AV, but you have a first and second choice. In the latest mayoral election where Sadiq Khan won, Sadiq Khan had 44.2% of the vote in the first round compared to Zach Goldsmith's 35%. After all the transfers, Sadiq Khan won with 56.8%. So, yeah, I mean, the transfers roughly went in the same proportions. Like if you look at the graphs on that link that will be in the show notes, if you look at like the bars, you can see it seems like a similar kind of proportion, roughly. Maybe a bit more went to Sadiq Khan than to Zach Goldsmith, but yeah, you can see the effect there that we've been describing. So there are more complex alternative voting systems. One of them, I believe, is partly used in Germany. I don't know which order you want to go through these, but the list system I know is employed in German national elections to some extent. It's not, and their system is actually 2 different types of vote at the same time, which I hadn't realised before I looked it up. So did you want to go onto the list system, or is PR easier to explain?
I think PR is easier to explain, and PR is kind of the umbrella term for things that encompass things like the list system.
Okay, so we'll start with that.
Yeah. So PR, or proportional representation, essentially means that people are voted in with the seats split up that more fairly represent the exact proportion of the vote that they won. So you have 100 seats in an area, a party wins 33% of the vote, they win 33% of those seats, of the seats available. That's the simplest example I can give. Okay? The list system is related to that. So let's say you're voting for, so in our example where there are 100 seats available and somebody votes and they get 10% of the vote, the party, like the Labour Party, will have to put up a list of 100 candidates that they want to win all of these 100 seats. But the Labour Party will rank those candidates for you. So if Britain moved to a PR system and the whole of the country was taken a whole, you can probably bet that even if Labour got 1% of that vote, Jeremy Corbyn would be the Labour person standing in because he'd be at the top of that list. Yeah. Does that make sense? So whenever you're dealing with proportional representation, you're always dealing with places that must vote multiple representatives to fill an area. So when we've just talked about the majoritarian systems, that's always just one person linked to one thing. That's why it's super important that they get 50% or they get the most. In PR, it's all about splitting them between a group of representatives that will share the vote in some way.
So trying to work out, so if, say, we were talking about this being for the general election in the UK, if you were doing first past the post as we currently do, you vote in your local area and the winner of your local area is your MP, and then they total up all the MPs, and the people with the party with the most MPs ends up as the government. With proportional representation, we would have to change things so that you were voting, presumably, like it was just a vote over the whole country, and then that chose people from a list, essentially. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah,
so,
you vote for the party, not for the person in PR. Yeah.
And so then you'd have to go and have a look at the party lists and see, who you thought was worthwhile and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the problem is you can't. There's multiple ways you can do list systems, but sometimes parties fix lists. So you might love Labour's policies, but not like Jeremy Corbyn. But it doesn't matter. Jeremy Corbyn would be the first MP on the list if they got any seat at all.
Yeah, because he's the head of the party. Yeah. Yeah.
So you'd have no say over the person. It's just about the policies. Some places do it where you can rank. It's usually where you have a much smaller example. So let's say there are, I'll put it down to like a state in America. They currently have like one state will have 10, 20 representatives that go to the House of Representatives. Imagine that they pulled all those votes together and it was just 20. They had a list of 20 candidates for the Republicans, list of 20 candidates for the Democrats. But you can actually put a number one against each candidate and rank the candidates like that. And you could even split your ballot saying, oh, I like 5 of these Democrats, but actually I like that one Republican.
Right, yeah.
And tally it up like that. So that's a basic list system and how it works and how the relevant representatives get elected into their parliaments.
And so mentioning Germany here, because as we said, the UK, the US, you use first past the post. In Germany, they have, it's quite interesting actually. So they have a vote for a direct candidate, which is a plurality vote in the local area. So like a first past the post. And then they have a second vote that goes to a party list, and that is for the state. And then those all go together form the national parliament. So it's actually a mixture. So there is some proportional representation in there. And I suppose that leads to one of the things that's often touted as a con of proportional representation, but I think essentially isn't. So I think we should mention is that, so people are like, oh, well, if we had proportional representation, well, 10% of the vote was for UKIP in one of the general elections. So we would have to have this many UKIP MPs, and that's all. Is generally how this, I know that's a straw man I'm holding up there, but that's generally how the criticism goes, is that like in this situation, we would have ended up with more of group we don't like being in. And that's true. And they've had this in Germany, where they have a far right party at the moment who have, I think they have like maybe 10% of the vote. And so that has led to a certain number of seats, or maybe it was actually more percent of the vote. And because they have both the local and this list, they've ended up with a smaller percentage than the overall vote share, but still they have ended up with some of those people in parliament. And I feel that that's just something you have to accept with proportional representation. Overall, it is a better reflection of the voting public's intention, and that small amount of the party you don't like is going to be properly represented. But then, for example, you have to trust that things would work overall. Like if there were more UKIP MPs in Parliament, yes, they'd make a fair amount of bluster, but you would assume that all of the other parties essentially oppose them. There might be some people on the right-hand side of the Conservative Party who agree with some of their viewpoints, but in general, you would assume that they're not going to be like the swing vote that are going to change everything, because with proportional representation, it would be a better view of what the whole country thinks. Is there more you can add to that to maybe help explain my point?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right that in PR, you get more minor parties being voted in. So you don't just get 2 parties that we've talked about. There's a far bigger multitude, and it forces coalitions to be built. And as you said, it's more likely that people would form a coalition to go against like a far right party, even if they did win sort of 10% of the vote. There's a situation in Sweden at the moment where the recent Swedish elections, I think the Nationalist Party increased their vote percentage to around about 20%, and the Social Democrats and the Conservatives are split about 40-40. So you would imagine that those two parties would join together to make sure that the nationalists don't get into power. However, it's quite hard when those two parties have traditionally been on opposite sides of the coalition for them to suddenly come together to oppose this smaller party. And one of the downsides of PR is that occasionally a small party, like a small fringe party, may hold the balance of power between two sides.
Yeah.
The nationalist power, they could decide to side with the Conservatives believing they can keep the worst tendencies of the nationalists sort of on the back burner, but it would still allow them to have some power. So yeah, there are pros and cons of each system. And like you mentioned with UKIP, it's unlikely that, it's more representative. It allows people to have their true view said. It makes people feel that their vote matters. When we were talking about first past the post, in both scenarios, even in alternative vote, if you're a Lib Dem supporter, if they're the third party, it's really hard for them to win a seat. So you feel your vote is wasted. In PR, it's a lot easier for that third party or a smaller party to get a representative in party. You feel like you're being listened to. But that does lead to maybe more extremes of views coming in.
So we've already mentioned STV. How does that actually work? Because you said it was for a group of candidates.
So it's just like the alternative vote system where you rank people. Apart from, so let's try and use a maths example where you have 5 parties and there are 3 seats available. Okay. One party. So red, blue, green, purple, yellow. The red party wins 60% of the vote. Okay. They're automatically over that 50% quota needed to win a seat. So they win a seat. However, they have 10% more votes than is needed. So that top 10% of votes is redistributed to the other parties. And their first choices are then redistributed to the others until one of the others gets over 50% and reaches the quota.
So the quota will be, say, 100% divided by number of seats. So if it was 10 seats, it'd be 10%. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. So in the example I gave, if there are 3 seats available, then Labour would only need to get 33% of the vote. And then all their extra votes are redistributed to the other parties until one of those gets 33%. And then those votes are redistributed. And then if those votes are redistributed and no other party gets over 33%, then it's given to the highest party remaining. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think I have seen that used. Yeah, that is like used with university elections. But as you say, in general, like university elections in the UK seem to be for individual positions. Obviously, there'll be alternative vote where you're picking between multiple candidates. But I think if you have like general members or something like that, they will use STV. What are these last two, which I don't think I've heard of? So you have is that the D-Hont formula? Is that Dutch? Because I can't do Dutch at all.
It's sort of D''Hont. I think he's a Belgian mathematician. So one of the problems I've just sort of highlighted with STV is that in that example where the red party wins 66% or wins 60%, but they only needed 33% to win, they don't get 2 seats out of those 3. They only get 1. So the D''Hont formula is meant to make it fairer. And I would point you towards, if you go on YouTube and search for Jeremy Vine and the D''Hont formula, he works you through an example of it and how
I'll
it works.
bung that in the show notes, yeah.
And how it works in the European Parliament election. So what happens is there are 10 seats available, all the votes come in, you look at all the votes. The Conservatives are the largest party, so you give them a seat and then you divide their vote total by the number of seats that they have won plus 1.
Right.
Okay? Then you look at the votes again. So you look at the votes again and you go, oh gosh, the Conservatives are still in the lead. They had 88,000. Now they've got 44,000 votes, but that's still more than the second place party. So now we give them another MP. So now they've got 2. You then divide their number of remaining votes, the 44,000, by the number of MPs they have plus 1. So you divide it by 3. Then you look at the number of votes that everybody else has got, and then you go, oh my goodness, UKIP have now got the largest amount of votes. You give them an MP. You then divide their number of votes by 2. And you keep doing this until you run out of MPs to give out to people.
Right. Yep.
watch the video. It makes way more sense when you can actually see it being distributed out in front of you. The most important thing this does that's better over STV is it gives, if you've won a lot of votes, it gives you more than one representative. Also, it really helps the smaller parties, because once you've started dividing the biggest party's vote by 3 or 4, then all of a sudden maybe the fourth or fifth largest party will have enough votes that in one round they can grab one representative. So when this happens in the EU elections, it's very common that that's where like the Greens get their most success. The Greens will pick up the last one because they just so happened, even if they were, I think in the example given, they're like a good 70,000 votes behind the Conservatives, and quite rightly the Conservatives will win 5 more MPs than the Greens will, but the Greens still gets represented, and they might have lost out through another way. So that's the d'Hondt formula. When we were talking about the benefits and of first past the post, I think you can agree that first past the post is far simpler to put in place than the d'Hondt formula. It's a lot easier to see where your vote has gone in first past the post rather than in under d'Hondt, but at least it leads to smaller parties getting represented in some way. So that's the d'Hondt formula. And
finally we have Hare and Droop. Like I looked for this and it didn't come up as like the top hit. It's
okay.
It's called a comparison of the Hare and Droop quotas on Wikipedia, which again in the show notes.
So the Hare quota essentially is what we were talking about PR when you say that you take the number of seats available and divide it proportionally. Sorry, you have 100 votes and there are 3 seats available. Somebody needs to get 33% to win that seat. And then you look at the next party and see which other one has 33%. You distribute it like that. In the Droop method, if there are 100 votes available and 3 seats, they calculate that by adding 1 more vote and 1 more seat and then dividing it up. So under the Droop formula, you'd actually only need 26% of the votes to get a seat.
What is the not the justification, but what is the intention behind that? Is that just to make it a bit easier? It sounds like that would favour the majority party a bit more.
Yes, it does, and that's entirely what it's meant to do. I watched a YouTube video on it earlier, and it was quite frustrating because it didn't go into the maths of it, but or into the detailed maths that I wanted it to. But they said that under the Hare method, if you had a result that was 52% red and 48% blue, the Hare method could work out the seats and actually make it so blue got 2 seats and red got 1.
Right.
Even though red got more votes. Under the Droop method, that's never the case. It will always favour the largest. It will always favour the largest party. So it's meant to take out that possible injustice that people could see when presented with one number and then the number of seats not quite coming out as they wanted. So that's that's proportional representation. There are a lot of different systems in there, and there are a lot of different ways that people can apply it. The big things to take away from proportional representation, if we're just looking for just general pros and cons, is that it tends to be far more representative of what people really want to see, so their vote doesn't seem wasted in a sense. The big con is that it's complicated and can lead to coalitions, which are a bit of a point whether you agree or disagree with them. But it does mean that you have to have more nuanced view of politics.
So we've had a question from the chat, which I think is probably a good one to ask, which is, in our opinions, what is the most fair voting system?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose my answer to this, which will maybe be shorter than yours, is that I think we should move away from first past the post. But I don't know if I've made a decision on exactly what we should move to. I feel like anything else at the moment out of those lists is better than what we currently have for representing what the people wanted. But I'm not sure. I mean, we had an alternative vote referendum where the alternative vote didn't win. I don't know if things would be better off with the alternative vote system compared to, say, proportional representation. I feel like proportional representation is, in general, is the fairest from a voter point of view, in that you're more likely to see the representation you expected. All that stuff we've just gone through with the maths of formulas, I hadn't really dealt with before. So I don't think I have an opinion on a particular version of proportional representation to go for. But what are your thoughts on that? What's the fairest voting system in your eyes?
My fairest voting system would be proportional representation across the whole country, which I think is only done in sort of like Ireland and Israel. There are places where they don't. Most places sort of like break their little proportional blocks down into regional areas. So they'd have like, so in the UK, like Somerset would be treated as one, and they'd group 5 together. Meanwhile, in Israel, they do the whole country, and that's 200 seats, and everybody votes. Like, if you did proportional representation in that way, that would be the fairest method. And then to make it even more fair, I would like to have a choice of the candidate that I wanted rather than having the party decide for me. So in that list method, that would be super fair. And of like the quotas given, I think I quite like, although D'Hondt sounds complicated, in my opinion, that's the fairest, because it means that you can equally split up the largest party, like, will get the most number of seats. There's no risk, sort of like in Hare and Droop, of the smaller parties not getting anything at all. D'Hondt really does favour the minor parties and make sure that they're represented. The downside to that is, if I wanted my system, can you imagine how complicated that would be? You would be given, you'd have,
we need more than just a swingometer, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, like, well, what would the ballot paper look like? If I walked in and I'm voting on 100 candidates, like there are 100 seats available, and I want to have my personal say over 100, and I've got to put 1 to 100 against lots of different candidates for every different party, and then counters having to count that up. So complicated. And elections would take so long, and it would sort of get, from a practicality point of view, it just wouldn't work. So that's why fairness is often balanced with practicality of not just counting them, but actually like governing, which I guess we'll move on to in a bit. But the actual like politics of governing and making sure that you can realistically run a country based on your election system.
Right. Yeah. So yeah.
Lots of factors.
Fair, yeah. So while you can make an argument for picking the fairest system, maybe it's just not practical, especially since there are so many problems. To say electronic voting, for example, would solve a lot of the maths side of things, but there are lots of problems with electronic voting in and of itself because of making it secure and so on. So shall we move on into types of electoral systems? Because I think we've covered we've covered voting systems in depth and how we actually vote for people. But so what kind of what kind of party systems people have? Like, we've talked about 2-party systems, multi-party systems. What did you want to say on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to move on that, like, electoral systems do have a very clear effect on party systems and what choice the voter is given when they get to the ballot box. So in the ones that we discussed, first of all, first past the post and even AV, that really favours a 2-party system to come out, because you need over 50% of the vote to win a seat, and you need an overall winner. People tend to vote more tactically with their vote than they would otherwise. So let's give an example close to my heart. If I want to vote in the general election, I might really want the Liberal Democrats to win. However, I know that they realistically have no chance of winning. So I'm forced to make a tactical decision on another candidate from one of the big 2 parties to make sure that my least worst candidate gets voted in. In a PR system, I don't have to worry about that so much. I can vote Lib Dem and think, okay, they might get a seat from this. And I know that I've wanted to vote with my heart and know what, like, my policies will be represented somewhere. I still think they're going to get 5-10% of the vote, but that doesn't matter. I've had my say and my views are being represented. So that's how the 2 different, like, electoral systems affect each party system and the choice that the voter's given. I've put down like a 2.5 party system, which sort of favours the alternative vote model that we discussed before. So in that scenario, I think Lib Dems are going to lose, but I still put them as my first choice on the ballot. It might just so happen that enough people are thinking like me that, oh, surprise, surprise, they actually, because people weren't forced to vote tactically, the Lib Dems get more seats. And that was kind of their argument when they were putting forward the alternative vote system as a referendum to the country, because they thought it would benefit them in that sense. The third party is still likely to be considerably smaller than the main 2, but it does increase their chances a little of winning more seats.
And I mean, we had even with a first past the post system, we ended up with the coalition because the only way for the Conservatives to have a majority was to ally themselves with the Lib Dems and vice versa, and there was a chance for the Lib Dems to actually get into power. And I remember being a student at the time in an area that was had traditionally voted Conservative, and enough students voted that year to make it a Lib Dem, to give us a Lib Dem MP in Leamington. That meant that we kind of really felt like we had been represented, and it is a very different feeling. I mean, it was the first general election I'd had the chance to vote in, but it's also that, like, oh yeah, I can see that a thing has changed because of what me and my friends did is a really important feeling. And I think that's important to consider when picking your electoral system, because you don't want to put off the average person or especially younger people who are very we're now in a period where, for various reasons, I feel there's a lot more activism kind of from younger voters. But if they continually vote in a way and don't see anything change, I think you will get a drop off in those people who actually care. Because if every time you vote, you don't get a little bit of your way, you're going to be like, well, what's the point in voting? And I know people have already made that decision. They're like, there's no point in voting. I'm one vote out of millions. And yes, that's true. But if everyone thought that way, then no one would ever vote. So,
Yeah.
I think that's my argument against that kind of logic. But I think there is a problem that if you don't have a system that better reflects people's views, then you turn people off from politics. And that means politics is really down to the politicians and the smaller group of people who actually get politically involved, maybe because there's something in it for them. And that's worse for the average person.
I think that brings us nicely on to our next topic of voter turnout, doesn't it, really?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Moving on to turnout. So as you've suggested, and as it's proved, generally in places where they have just a choice between two parties or it's first past the post, turnout drops off for exactly the reasons you've said. People get fatigued. They feel like they can't get their way. They ultimately feel that voting doesn't matter. There was a big trend when I started studying politics, sort of early 2000s, that turnout was really, really dipping. I think the UK general election in 2005 had one of its lowest turnouts yet, around 60%. There are lots of other factors that affect turnout, and maybe one of the reasons for that was that the Labour Party were expected to win. The Conservatives were seen to have little to no chance of winning, and it was about the third election in a row where it had looked like this. So a lot of people didn't even bother to turn out. In 2017, I think we've seen that in the most recent election that turnout started to go up again, but it's still not comparable to that in PR systems, where, as we've already suggested, people have far more choice. Even if you support a fringe party or a very small party, you still feel that your voice is going to be heard or represented in some way, and that just leads to a slight boost in turnout. It's interesting looking at, I found this turnout at UK general elections since 1918 graph. It feels to us like there is a lot more, it feels to me like more people are being involved in politics. And that is true if you're looking back to, say, 2001, when I was starting to pay attention. As you say, we've had a Labour government. Labour was probably definitely going to win, so the turnout was lower. But the actual 2017 percentage is still below the 1992 election. So while it may be, as far as I'm concerned, since I've been kind of vaguely paying attention to stuff, since I've been vaguely paying attention to elections, or at least remember them as a kid, it seems like people are voting more. We're still not up there with a 97 when Labour won, or 92, or basically any elections before that. There was a massive dip in the early 2000s, and we're just still recovering from that.
I think the other one to look at is the United States, which has, I've got a list from Wikipedia here that has turnout in national lower house elections. So this would just be House of Representatives elections. So they happen every 2 years since 1960 to 1995, and the average turnout in the United States is 48%.
Wow, that's really quite low.
When you consider that, like, the United Kingdom sits there on 76% because our lower houses of Parliament. Now, you can argue that there are many different reasons for that number being so low. Like, when we vote for our lower house, we're also voting for our prime minister. And in the United States, turnout for the actual presidential election is a lot higher than 48%. But still, it's a shocking figure when you think that the home of democracy, or a country where democracy is sort of held up as one of its core principles that voter engagement is so low. So yeah, it is a problem and leads to a big question of legitimacy. If you can't win 50% of that vote, and actually when you look at it, it's 50% of 48% of people, then do you really have the mandate to govern a country?
Yeah, it's interesting looking at this. I found a chart from Pew Research. Pew Research's Fact Tank, which I think is quite an amusing name. But intrigued to find that Belgium's at the top. I would have gone for Australia for reasons we're about to mention, I think. So Australia's actual percentage of the voting age population is a bit lower. Technically, the percentage of registered voters in Australia voting is the highest, I think. And that's because in Australia, they have compulsory voting. And I think we wanted to talk about that. So in Australia, you have to vote. And I believe it's a fine. I think we looked this up before. I can't remember what the fine is. It's not a terrible amount. Like, it's not going to bankrupt you, but it's also not a small amount. First time is $20, and then it increases to $50 if you've previously paid a penalty or been convicted in state elections. So, like, that's not in most cases enough to break the bank, but it's enough to not want to do it, in the same way that getting a parking charge is something you don't want. And so I mean, that leads to 90% of the registered voters actually voting. I imagine that there's a percentage of people who are ill or whatever on the day and are allowed to not vote because they're ill or whatever, and then some people paying the fine. But obviously that's a way to encourage people to vote. Yeah,
certainly. And the Belgian example that you gave, they actually have the oldest compulsory voting system in the world.
I didn't know that. Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah.
It was introduced in 1894. So that's why their numbers will be so high as well. It's one of the biggest reasons. That's the ultimate way that you can get people to turn out. And you may agree or disagree that you should force to have your vote, particularly if there's no candidate that you think can represent you. I know that the Australian voting system, they use the alternative vote, so it still favours a two-party system there. So it's possible, but at least you have a chance to put your first choice down. That might be a very small party, and then tactically vote with your second or third choices. I think compulsory voting is a good idea ultimately, but it does depend on if the country actually enforces it or not. I'm just having a look at my list of countries with turn. I've got a wonderful book, by the way, called Comparing Democracies.
Oh, that sounds good. Yep.
It was written back in 2005, so some of the numbers are a little dated, but just looking at it, there's a very consistent pattern of the countries that enforce compulsory voting always having a far, far higher turnout of sort of 80% plus compared to those that don't, that usually fall below that threshold. If we're going to go on just to other factors that affect voter turnout rather than just party systems and stuff like that, it can be silly things or relatively minor things that you'd think
the weather
didn't really matter. The weather is one. If it's raining, turnout generally tends to be lower. The number of days the polls are open.
Mm-hmm.
If the polling day is sort of set as a national holiday, if it's a work day or a rest day, if postal or proxy or advanced voting is allowed or not allowed, all of those factors, essentially anything that makes it, if the polls are open for 3 days and all of those are days off work and you can post in advance, then it's really easy to vote, so people are more likely to do it. Compare that to another system where you can't do that. It's on a work day. It's only open for 1 day. Some people, I've had personal experience of people just going, "Are you going to vote today?" "Nah, I don't think I'll have time." Which seems mad when you only have your say once every 5 years to say how the country's governed.
Yeah, so on the day of the 2015 election, I was told I had to urgently be in Manchester when I was voting in Hampshire. I'd gone into work with the intention of voting in the evening and had to go up to Manchester suddenly. So I was like, well, this is literally what the emergency voting procedures exist for. And so I had to get an emergency proxy vote. And a friend of mine happened to be driving up from Portsmouth and was therefore going to go past. So he had to go into the village hall, present his ID and say, I am voting on behalf of Tom, and cast my vote for me. And obviously I have to trust that he voted the way I wanted him to. It was an interesting situation to be in. I'd never had to read up on those procedures before, and it was very much a race against time to kind of ring up the local council, tell them what the problem was. And then they had to send me a form. I'd just print the form where I was at Manchester University, get it scanned, borrow a scanner from some random office to scan it back in and send it back to them signed, so that they could then be yeah, okay, you've got approval. And then my friend was sitting in Portsmouth for half an hour extra than he was planning, because he had to then wait for me to say, yes, you're good to go. You can go and vote for me. It was very, and it worked. I was able to vote, but it was a lot of effort on my part to ensure I voted. And I think most people in that situation probably be like, it doesn't really matter, especially considering I was in a safe Conservative seat. So it didn't actually matter. It was something like 70% Conservative, being in a very rural, posh kind of Hampshire area. It didn't really matter because had I voted whatever way I voted, it wasn't going to change the outcome. But I felt like I should vote. And I think not everyone, if some people aren't so strong in their conviction that they should vote, then you want to do anything you can to encourage them, such as cooking sausages for them, which even in Australia, where they have compulsory voting, they have these Australian sausages. Did you put that in the show notes, or did I?
I did not put Australian sausages in the show notes.
Okay, so
what that means.
All right, so this is the thing. So while it's compulsory in Australia, you still get people not voting. So there's these things called sausage sizzles at the various polling stations, and this is it's just a thing they have in Australia. There'll be someone cooking. Oh, sorry, it's the democracy sausage is the colloquial name given to it. It's a fundraising sausage sizzle held at polling places on election day, and I will put the link in the show notes. But this is just an amusing idea that the democracy sausage does also mention that some places do vegan and vegetarian sausages, so it's not, it is inclusive, but it is it's just interesting because that's not a thing we have. You might get a cup of tea maybe at a polling station in the UK, depending on where it is. Sometimes they're in schools or church halls where someone will just put on cups of tea or something, but I don't think we have as much of a I don't know how I'd describe it. We don't really have an equivalent thing. We don't have this kind of you get something for going and voting in the UK.
No, the only thing that comes to mind, but it's not really related to voting, is that as part of our electoral rules in the UK, the media is not allowed to report on anything on election day that vaguely favours one political party or the other. So the neutral position taken by most places, and I think the BBC started this, and it's gone on since then. Pictures of dogs at polling stations.
Yes, yeah, dogs at polling stations. You tend to get You tend to get a picture of each party leader casting their vote, just to show that they've all gone and voted, which is normally in the morning. And I'm trying to think what other things don't have, but it is a weird day where you're like, I want to know something, but there's nothing to know yet. So, especially if, when we were doing coming up to our election special that we did, well, it wasn't really an election special, but when we were doing our election episode, we were going to record that weekend. So, we knew we'd know all the results. But that day I was really paying attention to stuff, but there's nothing, you can't find anything out, which is entirely sensible, but it is a weird feeling that you're like, oh, everything's going on, and there's no news. And then 10 p.m, they're like, boom, now we can do the news. And it's that day is kind of a weird day with no news.
It's just everything's on pause, isn't it? Until chaos breaks loose over the night, and then and having stayed awake for both the Brexit vote and the US election with Trump, because for various reasons I was on call with people based in LA, so I could stay up all night. I feel like I'm going to have to start taking Fridays off after elections. Stay up and watch all the stuff. But maybe we should do some kind of live stream next time it happens. We've got a few years to prepare, hopefully. Fingers crossed. But I'm ahead of you. I've already taken Fridays off on both of those. I kind of needed it after the Brexit vote as well. I don't think I would have been.
So we've summarised electoral systems pretty well, I'd think, and we're going to throw in some links to videos that maybe better describe them. It's better with visuals, and there's only so much we can do in an audio medium. Describe some party systems and factors that affect voter turnout. I'm not sure there's anything else we can really say without just rambling on at this point.
No, the one thing that we kind of missed, but we touched on it with the German system, is that we've explained the basics. A lot of places now, like Germany, choose to have a mixture of the two. So as you said, they have first past the post ones for local elections and PR for their national elections, because they try and balance the pros and cons of each and just have both of them and try and have it's nice that people have somebody wins in their local area and they relate to them. We'll have the first past the post system there, and we'll have the national one for more fair PR things. So that's the way that countries are getting around that problem. But it's not really, like I mentioned at the start, not many people are actually changing their system.
So I suppose maybe a question which I apologise I haven't prepared you for at all, but to tack on the end. I know you're normally the one posing me a question at the end of a normal episode, so I can pose you a question at the end of a special. We've discussed a bit with talking about Congress and everything in our first special, and the House of Lords we've discussed, and they're an unelected chamber. If you could instigate the voting reform, electoral reform you wanted to carry out and see in the UK, what would you do with the two houses we have and the voting system?
I think I would like the alternative vote for the lower house. So you could have a choice, but you'd still end up with one constituency MP. The winner of that vote would still be Prime Minister and still be in charge. I think that would be the most practical solution. Wouldn't be too much of a change for people. I was fairly surprised that it got rejected when it was actually put forward as a referendum, but I think there were more sort of party political reasons that was rejected rather than just sensibleness of the proposals. And then with the House of Lords, I'd definitely make it democratically elected, and that's where I'd split my systems. That's where I'd have it PR, and that to represent the views of the entire country. They'd probably still be like the lesser house, or still sort of, we mentioned in our UK comparison episode that the Lords isn't as powerful as the House of Commons, and I probably would still keep them in that advisory role, that it would give everybody a chance of feeling that, that they'd had their say and that their view is represented. If you think of a party like the Greens, they've only got one MP in the Commons. They deserve, I think, or their share of the vote nationally deserves that they have more say in the Lords and more ways to sort of like influence policy more than they have at the moment. So yeah, that would be my dream scenario. It's not very
not very likely. No.
Well, it's not very likely, but also it's not like the loftiest ambition that I could. I feel like if I wanted to really rip it apart, I can, but I feel that that's the one that would work most practically and wouldn't freak most people out. Like, having the alternative vote would really keep the structure of UK politics there and wouldn't shake it up too much. And my personal feelings about the Lords is that it's outdated and in quite a big need of a change. So if you're going to change it, you might as well go PR and have it as a kind of a sort of like a valve, a pressure release, allows people to have their say. Like, would people have really been, like, would UKIP voters still been as angry? Like, if you think of the 2015 election where they got loads of percent of the vote, but one MP, if they were more represented in the House of Lords, they may feel like their actual opinion was being represented fairer there, and it might lead to like more conversation and more dialogue, which I think we're in need of in these times at the moment, rather than the quite combative politics that we have.
Okay, so thank you for joining me, Rob, and thanks for helping walk me and our listeners through the various voting electoral systems we've got and what our options are, if we can maybe one day make a change. I think, this is the last of our silly season specials. A lot of politics has started happening. It's started to filter through any possible bubbles I've thrown up. So I think we need to get back to talking about normal politics. Do you think we should go back to that? Are we waiting 2 weeks, or do you think it's getting to the point where we need to come back next week?
Maybe coming back next week and having a bit of a summer roundup would be a good idea.
Okay, we'll be back to your normal scheduled programming on politics with a bit of a summer roundup next week. An early episode, that would seem like. But yes, I feel like we have to come back and start talking politics again because there's a lot to talk about. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our listeners who are there in the chat. If you want to join them, you can join us on Discord. I will put a link in the show notes. Sorry, you can also find us on Facebook at Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter at Unparl Podcast. And you can, of course, go to parliamentary.observer, our website, to find all the episodes and the show notes. Of course, they'll also pop up in any podcast player of your choice. And you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can give us a little bit of money, which will hopefully one day get Rob a slightly better microphone. Although I hope everyone is noticing his audio quality is a bit improved because I've been doing some filters that I hope have made it sound a bit clearer to everyone.
Thank you.
And I think it's a good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. That's so that's sort of like it's called let me get my words out. Sorry.
That's fine. Don't worry.
That system is called polarity.
Polarity or plurality?
The one you said and the one I physically can't say. You've got to say this because I'm not.